Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ben here. I'm back again today doing another video. And the subject of today's video is going to be on, again, The Walking Dead. Last video I made, I did my top 10 favorite characters from The Walking Dead TV show. Today I'm going to be doing my top 10 favorite characters from The Walking Dead comic. So just as a bit of background, I do both watch the show and read the comics. I'm I enjoy both a lot. I'd say I actually prefer the comics a little bit more, just because you can do more in a comic book than you can in a TV show. In a TV show, you have to adhere to production restrictions and a budget, whereas you can really write anything into a book and draw any picture on a page to have anything happen. So I think I like the how much more free comic books are to really do what they want to do. So for that reason, I think I like the comics a bit more. I do enjoy both mediums a lot though. Uh, and if you aren't aware, the Walking Dead TV show deviates in certain places from the comics. They do follow the same general arcs, but the things that happen to specific characters is switched around quite a bit. And although most of the characters are the same from the comics to the TV shows, there are some that are omitted from the TV show. There were some that were added for the TV show. And a lot of the characters that are in both mediums have very different plot arcs, or just in general have very different characteristics. I think one of the best examples would be like Carol from the differences from the comics to the TV show. In the comics, Carol's like a mid to late 20s woman who's considered kind of like a babe, and she has like a lot of self-esteem issues, but she's like a sought after person in the community, and she has a relationship with Tyrese, and she commits suicide. Whereas in the TV show, you'd say she's probably more around early to mid 40s, and she isn't really like a babe. She's more of a mom figure in the group, and she doesn't really have self esteem issues. She's much more like a badass, and just overall a very different character. But that's just an example. So let's get into the top 10. My number 10 character is the governor, and he isn't one of the characters I liked the best, but I think he's a character that was really necessary for this series. You know, the series had minor villains before the governor in the comics. You had Shane, who was kind of a villain, but more or less just an antagonist. He wasn't a true villain, and he was around very briefly. Besides him, you had some of the prisoners who Rick and his group met when they first got to the prison. Really not really not around long enough to be true villains though. Again, sort of more just antagonists. But the governor is the first true villain of the series, I'd say. Definitely has a conflict with Rick, and he is evil, definitely. I think he's actually a way worse character than the governor is in the TV show. I think he's a lot less depth and a lot less background and a lot less reasoning. And there is a governor comic for his background that you can read, but I've never gotten around to reading it. But I just think within the show or the main comic book series itself, the governor has a lot less depth than in the comics than he did in the show, but he still is necessary to kind of kick off what a true villain would be to the group. At number 9, I have Jesus, who I like a lot better in the comics than in the show. I think in the show he comes off just a lot less like meaningful and a lot more background, whereas in the comics he seems like a lot more badass. Number one, he seems to be a lot better of a fighter. He seems to be much more integral to what's going on too. Like he forges a lot of important relationships and connections for the groups. So I think he does that too in the show, but it's more like you only know it as much in the show if you've read the comics and you know some of his background. If you just were going off the show, he wouldn't seem as important as he does when you read the comics. Number 8, I have Dale, a character who got a lot longer of a run in the comics than on the show. In the terms of how long the comics last and versus how long he lasts on the show, he dies in season 2 of the show, which is very early on. Whereas if he were to last as long as he did in the comics, that would be up to around like middle of season 5. So he would have lasted a lot longer. On the comics, he's much less of a wise sage as he is in the show, and much more of just like a normal mid-aged guy. He has a relationship with Andrea that's interesting, And he's on this list because of his longevity. He was in the comics for a long time. He was in from all of Compendium 1, which is the first 48 issues, to I think middle of Compendium 2. So I think it's around like issue, I want to say 70 that he's around, maybe even a little bit later. Um, I don't know the exact issue, but he was definitely just a character that was a good like sounding board for Rick and a lot of other characters. At number 7, I have Dwight, who is a guy that got introduced around the time of the Saviors plotline. He's basically the Daryl Dixon of the comic books. He's a redneck. He has half his face burnt off. He is a really interesting guy because of what he went through serving Negan and then afterwards with being in charge of the Saviors and a whole bunch of other stuff, but not to spoil too much. I think that he is a lot more present in the comics, I think, than he was in the TV show. He was definitely present for 2 seasons in the TV show, but that character was written out of the main Walking Dead show, and I think he was put into Fear the Walking Dead, which I'm not really a fan of. But so his run on the television show was a lot less than his run in the comics. Um, let's see here. At number 6, I have Abraham, who is a character who I enjoyed a lot more in the comics just because I think he was a lot more prevalent. I think he was also prevalent in a way in the show, but he was prevalent among the supporting characters, whereas in the comics, because there's no Daryl, he really takes that void for Rick. After Tyrese is out of the picture, he's really like Rick's like best friend for a while in the comics. And he basically takes over, like, think of in TV show terms, think of the role that Daryl had from say like seasons 4 to 7. That's the role that Abraham had, a lot more front and center than the Abraham TV show character. Number 5, I have Michonne, who I just like better in the comics. I don't know why. It's nothing against Danai Gurira. I like her acting just fine. I just think that the Michonne in the comics is a bit more edgy, a bit more like harsh and cold, but also we get these pockets of times where she breaks down a lot more and shows a lot more emotion than I think the TV show Michonne has ever revealed. I think there are moments where we learned about TV show Michonne, but I think they just give more background to the comic book version, and I think she gets more opportunities to reveal emotion and background. Number 4, I have Andrea, who gets a much longer run in the comics. She lasts up just significantly longer. In the show, she ends at the end of the Governor arc, which in the comics that would have made her death at issue 48, but she lasts much far past that in the comics. She hooks up with Dale. She starts a relationship with Rick that's long lasting, and I don't know. She just is a lot less whiny in the comics, and they focus a lot more on her being the sharpshooter than I think they did in the TV show. They made that part of her in the TV show, but they make that like her, like almost her identity in the comics. Um, and she's also quite a bit younger. I think in the show she's aged up to be around 35. In the comics, she's more like 25 when it all starts. Yeah, I just find her a lot less annoying and a lot less whiny, and they give her more purpose in the comics. Number 3, I have Tyrese. He was a really good dude. He didn't get much shine in the TV show. He didn't get much time. But in the comics, for basically all of Compendium 1, he's essentially the second leading character. He again kind of fills the Daryl role pretty much for the up until the Governor arc. He's like the second leading dude. And actually, I'd say his part in the comics is bigger than Daryl's part was in the TV show during that time. Um, they changed his character. They changed Tyrese's character a lot for the TV show, making him much more of a supporting background character. But in the comics, he's like right front and center. Like Rick is character number 1. Tyrese, you'd say, is pretty clearly number 2, in my opinion. And he's just a good guy that has Rick's back and isn't a good person at heart too. At number 2 on my list for the comic book characters, I have Negan. He is given so much more free reign in the comic books. He can swear freely, which he really can't do on the TV show except for the occasional SHIT. In the comics, you learn a lot more about who he is and what his character is. because he's allowed to speak like his character really speaks, which is throwing in the F-bomb essentially every other word. Um, he has a very interesting arc, and they're trying to emulate that in the TV show now, but I think it just has more development in the comics, and um, I think Jeffrey Dean Morgan actually does a great job playing him in the TV show, and I think um, it's one of the ones where I think like the show and the comic book version are comparable, but I think just because of the swearing, honestly, and a bit of the gruesome, uh, kind of vulgar aspects of the comic book character, a lot of that has to get omitted because this is basic cable that the show's on. So Jeffrey Dean Morgan's version is very watered down, I feel like, from the comic book version, but still a lot of really good elements there too. And number one, Rick. Could it be anybody else? I think the one of the things I've noticed because I'm rereading the comic books right now, and um, is that Rick's character in the comics is much more the definitive main character than he was on the show. On the show, it felt more like an ensemble cast where Rick is the biggest part of the ensemble, whereas in the comics, it's like Rick is definitively the main character. It's like no doubt Rick's story. And here's what my example would be sort of. In the show, I think you say like, okay, who are the main characters? You'd say Rick, Daryl, Glenn, Carol, Maggie, Lori for a time, Shane for a time, the governor for a time, Negan for a time. You'd say that those were like the group, or Carl. You'd say those were like the main characters. And for me, in the comics, really there haven't been more than like three main characters. Arguably, you could say Rick is really the only main character, and everybody else is supporting. In the comics, there's very I don't want to say there's very few, but there's significantly less moments that take place without Rick. In the show, there's entire episodes and stretches of episodes that have taken place without Rick, and now the show doesn't even exist with Rick on it anymore. Whereas with the comics, up until for the most part in general, it's all Rick centric, and not much honestly goes on without Rick being at the center of the action. It's just a lot different. Rick's much more the focus, I think, and for those reasons, he has to be the number one. Thank you guys for tuning in. Leave your list below if you have one of your thoughts on the top 10 Walking Dead comic book characters, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.